This film, Port Nelson 1949, is the result of an idea conceived by Mr. Bill Parr, then Secretary-Manager of the Nelson Harbour Board, to assist in the publicity for the poll of ratepayers held on the 19th of October 1949. This poll was required to obtain public approval for the loan of the first $1 million, as authorised by the Act of Parliament in 1948, to commence the major development of Port Nelson, a work which has far exceeded that which was originally envisaged. This film was shown at 12 of the public meetings which the Harbour Board held throughout the Nelson Harbour district. The idea was to show a typical day at the port, the men, the ships, how these were handled, and the goods which passed over the wharf, especially to people in outlying districts who had not seen the port. This is a panoramic view of the port, taken from about Allashore Island. Our day starts with a coastal ship arriving in the early morning for the purpose of loading fruit, which would be transshipped at Wellington for the overseas markets. This ship is one of the Richardson Line vessels, and you see her now approaching the entrance. The south mole of the entrance is in the distance, and the pilot launch will come steaming alongside. These shots are taken on board ship from a Union Company vessel called the Waipahi, which used to run a round trip fortnightly between the southern ports of Dunedin, Oamaru, Timaru, and Littleton and Nelson, bringing cargoes of fertilizer and other goods from these ports. It was a very good service, but was discontinued after the East Coast Railway was completed. Early morning arrivals at the wharf with the Nelson taxis, lined up to pick up passengers from the Wellington ferry which has just berthed. The first cargo brought ashore is the mails, dumped on the wharf. The mails were taken up to town by the post office contractor. The Watersiders are now arriving for work and receive their orders for the day from the Watersiders Assembly Hall. In a moment you'll see the picking up of the non-union labour outside the building. Bob Reeves is wearing a peaked cap, and he's reading out the names of non-union men allocated to jobs for that particular day. The Harbour Board tractors and trailers, very useful equipment for transporting goods around the wharf very quickly, also prepared for work. The The Nelson Railway used to run out to Glen Hope until it was dismantled in 1956. You'll see more of the Nelson Railway later. Containers, of course, were something new, and that one was a house-to-house removal container. This cask probably contained sheepskins. Here is the waterman. These were the days before radio telephones, when from the signal mast a numeral flag would indicate to an incoming ship the number of the berth to which that ship had been allotted. At night time, instead of flags, the board had a series of light signals, red-green, red-white in various combinations, which indicated from the signal mast the numerals which masters could see from outside the cut, and they would know from this number the number of their berth. The Pearl Casper has just arrived and has brought in a cargo of sheep. These sheep are to be discharged through a sheep race just below the old Harbour Board office into a holding pen. Drovers will come down and drive the sheep along Rocks Road, right to the freezing works or the city abattoir, usually in the early morning. The wharves in those days displayed wide varieties of cargoes. These are coils of fencing wire, with one of the old hand barrows which the watersiders used in the foreground. Concrete pipes and other articles of cargo. Reinforcing iron. And in the background you can see the Custom House Hotel, and alongside one of the railway engines. These shots were taken on board the old Puriri of the Anchor Company. She used to bring heavy cargoes to Nelson, and her heavy lifting gear was very useful. These are wharf piles being discharged at the moment. A heavy piece of machinery. Heavy crate. It was a very, very tricky procedure to get these crates placed exactly on the truck's deck by the ship's gear. Sacks of manure were an ever-present problem. Heavy trucks were also carried on deck. The Puriri was very suited to handle that kind of cargo. Timber was an imported cargo in those days when there was no timber exported. Our pine trees hadn't grown sufficiently, and much of the timber which came to Nelson was landed at the wharf. coal being shunted. The colliers used to discharge by grab, either into trucks as you see now, or overside into the old coal hulk. Occasionally the coal was dumped on the wharf and then scooped up by a front-end loader. This is a coastal tanker, the Shell Company's Power, which was a regular visitor and did a very good job around New Zealand coasts. But she is very small by today's standards. Here she is, moving out through the entrance. Here is an overseas tanker, which too is small by comparison with today's tankers. This one would be about 500 feet in length, and with this ship in port, she would have to overhang considerably at the bow, a practice which ship owners generally do not agree with. These were the only overseas ships, about 6 per year, trading to Nelson at that time. You can see how the bow is overhanging. This overhang was necessary in order to allow the ferry boat to berth at the rear of the tanker. Oil is coming ashore, and the pumps she used pulsate through the pipes. The tanker is now leaving, preceded by the pilot launch. Of course, there were no tugs in those days, and even a tanker like that had to rely entirely on her own power. Going out through the entrance. The lows of the entrance can be seen by this shot, which also shows the seas breaking on the inside of the northern edge of the cut. Petrol in road tankers is now leaving the old Shell Company's depot, where the entrance was right on the wharf, and going out past the old Custom House Hotel. Wharf repairs caused never-ending problems to the board at that time. And before the days of the chainsaw, the only way was to cut timber by a large two-man saw, which you can see in the picture now. The board 7-ton steam crane was mounted on rails on the railway lines, thus using the railway lines as a base. This was a very useful tool dating from the early 1900s. Here is part of the wharf before the decking was put on, showing part of the understructure. Pile driving before the days of automatic steam hammers. The only way to do it was by a big monkey frame with the monkey on top. And you can see the heavy weight dropping. That was about a 2-ton iron weight, which would fall about 6 or 8 feet, going thump on top of the pile. The number of blows per minute were counted and the penetration measured. These piles are being driven underneath where the number 3 shed now is. Number 3 shed was one of the early contracts in 1948, carried out for the board by Mr. Bill Gibbons, our chairman in 1980. The wharf had to be continually washed. Here's the waterman with a powerful hose washing down the wharf before the wharf could be used for the loading of meat and fruit. The upkeep of the channel buoys was always a problem. These buoys were lifted about once every 6 months. They were lit by a battery light, a 12-volt ordinary car battery with a small powered bulb was the only means of illumination. The buoy and the mooring block would be lifted out of the water and cleaned of marine growth before being painted and returned to their original position. This was a job carried out by the pilot launch and the pilot crew, a very arduous task with very inadequate equipment. This shows the pilot crew scraping the mussels and barnacles off the bottom of the buoy. The harbour master, Captain Christie, is now taking sextant angles as the sounding of the entrance channel is recorded on the echo sounder, which had recently been installed into the number 1 pilot launch. This shows the echo sounder working and recording the depths on special paper. The positions of the soundings would then be charted in the office. The arrival of the first forklift truck in 1949 was an event which everyone looked forward to. We had to get a special import license to enable this truck to be imported into New Zealand. There was no agency in New Zealand for forklift trucks at that particular time. Here's the first forklift truck being tested. The Nelson Harbour Board was a pioneer in the use of forklift trucks for cargo handling, and the effect was markedly improved loading. So much so that before many years were out, the board had a large fleet of these machines. That machine was watched with great interest. This is the frog pond behind the number 2 shed, now to be filled in, showing some old coastal ships tied up, as well as the fishing launches. Always a point of interest, as well as of congestion. Here we see the Nelson to Wellington ferries, the Arahura and the Matangi, which were the last of the coastal ships around the New Zealand coast to be fueled by coal. And there is the collier with the coal hulk outside. You can now see the Arahura and the collier, as well as the coal hulk behind the stern of the overseas tanker. Fruit loading was something which the board was concerned about greatly because of the extent of the manhandling. You can see the way each individual case was manhandled, and the same thing had to be done in Wellington when the fruit was transshipped there into overseas ships. The Urata was one of the anchor company's colliers bringing coal from the west coast to ports such as Wanganui, Nelson and elsewhere. Meat loading was also moved from Nelson Freezing Works into coastal vessels for transshipment at Wellington. These vessels, such as the Rana and the Inaha, were insulated vessels but not refrigerated. Meat used to be brought down by truck and by railway wagon and then thrown into the slings and lifted into the coastal ships. various cargo being discharged onto the wheelbarrows which the men used, and also fertilizer in sacks. In port now is one of the anchor company's ferries. It is the Matangi, taking cargo to Wellington for transshipment. In the background you will see cheese, and in the foreground butter. Every afternoon, the line of trucks used to extend from the wharf right back to the Custom House Hotel, all bringing cargo for shipment to Wellington. Round about 3 o'clock, when the last cargo was supposed to be on the wharf, the scene would often be like this, and it was a very hectic period of the day to get all this cargo on board. Fruit is being taken on board in 17-case trays, and the manhandling, as you can see, was very damaging to the quality of the fruit landing in England, with the manhandling not only in Nelson, but also in Wellington, where the same procedure occurred all over again. The cases used to be thrown about and tramped on and dropped. Here more cases are again going on board. Compare that with the sophisticated handling by straddle trucks and forklift trucks today. Cheese from Rye Valley being loaded. There's the Matangi on the left and another coastal vessel in the distance. The Matangi and the Arahura ran 6 trips every week to and from Nelson. There is Mr. Jones, a board member and secretary of the Watersiders Union, acting as hatchman on that particular day. A typical scene every afternoon was the line of trucks with quinces and tomatoes and all other produce from Nelson. There was only one way to send it then, and that was by sea. Here's the locomotive of the Nelson Glenhope Railway. It had to stop at the edge of the wharf because it was not allowed to go any further. From then on, the wagons used to be shunted by harbour board tractors. This scene outside number 2 shed shows the congestion which resulted from railway trucks and motor vehicles, harbour board cranes, and generally everything that rolled passing through that particular point at that time. The Minister of Marine, the Honourable F. Hackett, came to visit the port one day. Here he is with the chairman of the board pointing out something of interest. And he's followed now by some of the board members. The man waving his hat was Mr. Bill Smith, the Secretary for Marine, and other board members are following. Mr. Chisnell, and the executive officers bring up the rear. They all then went into the pilot launch for a trip around the port. The harbour master is wearing his white uniform cap. This graph shows the trend of trade which Bill Parr forecast at that particular time. It proved very conservative indeed, for the growth of trade was far more than he ever expected. This shows some of the varieties of cargo which passed over the wharf. Diagrams are interesting. This one depicts an overseas ship 500 feet long coming into the port and manoeuvring as she ties up alongside the wharf, all without aid of a tug. It was just by backing and filling a 500-foot ship in a channel 750 feet wide. You can imagine turning a motor car on a relatively narrow road, how you would have to back and fill in order to get round. The same thing happened with ships. There is a ship tied up alongside with a ferry boat at the rear. In this particular picture, which was in the weekly news, the Matangi is in the foreground on the inside of the main wharf. Here's the cut as it was in those days, originally, showing the narrowness of the navigable area and the clearance which the ship had. It was a matter of inches below the keel of the ship, even at the top of spring tides. What was wanted was a much wider cut and a greater clearance underneath. These pictures show the dredging required. just the shaded areas, the outer shoal, and the inner sailing course, and the big swinging basin, which is now north of the main wharf, and the area to be reclaimed. The last pictures show the proposed diversion of the Maitai River. That film on Port Nelson was made in 1949. The commentary from the script prepared by Bill Parr was added in 1983, and the Harbour Board acknowledges the assistance of the Resource Centre of Nelson Polytechnic and of Radio Nelson in the making of this videotape. It's interesting to compare the activities recorded in the 1949 film with those depicted in the film commissioned by the Harbour Board in 1980. Port Nelson continues to grow and expand. This early film remains as a testimony to the foresight, energy and dedication of the board and management of that era.